Thanks for joining us on Wellness Talk Radio. I'm Chris Costello, and today we are talking with David Flink, author of Thinking Differently, an inspiring guide for parents of children with learning disabilities. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on the show. I really appreciate being here.
So I enjoyed this book, and a lot of what I enjoyed about it was your personal story. You were a kid with dyslexia and ADHD, and you went through the public school system, or it sounds like private school system, actually, or a combination of both?
I tried it all. I had a little bit of everything.
And that's pretty common for parents and kids with these issues, huh?
Very, very, very common. In the course of my education, I went through 5 different types of schools, actually.
One of the things you kind of describe, the very moving part of the book, you describe what it was like to be out in the hallway when overhearing a parent-teacher conference. So how about if we start there?
Yeah, so I'll say, in terms of sharing my story, I actually didn't initially write a lot of my story, and then I realized that I needed to offer to families myself as a mentor. And so my story began in that hallway. So I was sort of a problem kid. And when your job is to sit in school and sort of sit still and read out loud, and those things you don't do very well, you get in trouble a lot. So I'd be asked to read out loud, and because I couldn't do that, I would sort of, create some kind of distraction. I had taken up magic as a hobby, so I'd light a fireball in the middle of class, and the next thing you know, I was out in the hallway or on the way to the principal's office, and I felt like I must just not be a smart kid. I must not belong in school. It was a very hard way to go through a lot of my early education. And
the conversation with your mom and the teacher was, a conversation I think that happens a lot, right?
Yeah, so there's a moment in the book which I think you're thinking about where I was sitting in the hallway. It was a parent-teacher conference, and I'm just waiting for the meeting to end, and I kind of overhear this conversation where the teacher is just telling my mother, I just wish David would try harder. And I overhear this, and my poor mother, who actually happened to also be a teacher in the school, I think she had no clue what to do. And, she kind of wanted to defend me. She knew that I was trying as hard as I could, but she also saw my grades and saw, probably at some level what the teacher was saying was true. And I so distinctly remember she walked out, and she looked like a woman in the shell of a woman. And we walked home in silence, because I think at that moment, neither of us knew what to say. And I was born in 1980, and at this time, there wasn't a lot of awareness around dyslexia, around ADD. And frankly, between 3rd grade and 5th grade, a lot of my schooling was like that story. I would actually try to do well in school, but because I couldn't do things the way that they were asking me to do, I would do poorly. There'd be a parent-teacher conference. The teacher would say, I wish David would try harder. And then we wouldn't know what to say to each other. And the truth is, I didn't need to try harder. I needed to try differently. And that's really where the gift of being ultimately given the label of dyslexia and ADHD in the 5th grade, that gave me a window to opportunities, a window to try things differently. And openly, it opened an entire education that I had no clue existed for me. I thought I was just going to drop out of school, frankly.
And you're listening to Wellness Talk Radio. We're talking with author David Flink about his book, Thinking Differently. And we're talking about kids that learn differently and what we need to do to help them and encourage them and really get them to see their gifts. And you mentioned awareness, and there is much more awareness now about learning challenges. But I think for a lot of people, that same experience happens where we're remediating. We're trying to get these kids to learn things that they may not necessarily have strengths in. And David, I want to ask you, because I know you outreach to lots of people about learning challenges. What percentage of the population is struggling with ADHD and dyslexia?
So I surprise a lot of people when I share this. Actually, 1 in 5 people in America. So 20% of our population has some form of a learning difference. And I love your framing. I think it's learning abilities, but it's just a different learning ability than, the 4 in 5 people who learn a more traditional way. And, I'll say a couple of more things around those stats because for me, if you think about 20% of our population, it actually constitutes what is one one of the largest minority groups in our country. And what's amazing to me in thinking about that 20% is that the success rate and the failure rate on both ends are pretty extreme. So students who have learning disabilities or learning differences drop out of school twice as often as kids without learning differences. Overrepresentation of kids with learning differences in our federal prison population, 40% are illiterate or have a learning disability. And then if you look at the other side, the potential, you go into just the Fortune 500 companies in America. A third of the top 100 Fortune 500 companies, a third of the people who run those companies are dyslexic, which is an amazing statistic. And you can think about, everyone's probably heard about a celebrity or two. We have way more than a celebrity or two that have this learning difference. So you think about people like Whoopi Goldberg. What would life be like if we didn't have Whoopi Goldberg or Henry Winkler, or Tom Cruise? These are all people who have learning differences. So we have some great minds in our society that I feel like when we don't serve them well in our school system, we often are just throwing them away.
Right, and what a waste of potential. And, I know there's people out there that they might have children, that they sense something's different, but they're not quite sure. So, David, what are some of the things, the classic things, the signposts of people that struggle with dyslexia and ADHD?
The first thing I want to highlight is actually what you just said. So if you sense that, for the folks listening, if you sense there's something going on different with your kid, there probably is. There's a lot of signposts, which I'm going to mention in a moment. Before that, there's actually kind of a feeling. The feeling that I described when my mom was sitting in the classroom talking to my teacher, and she's saying, try harder. And she's like, there's something up, because I know my kid is trying harder. I know these kids don't, these grades don't represent what my kid's doing. So there's something actually in the unseen that I think is important. But then there's some easy tells. So kids who learn to read late, kids who have trouble decoding words. So if you show them a word and they have trouble figuring out what are the sounds that are naturally associated with those letters, that's what dyslexia looks like. And in terms of attention issues, you hear a lot like, oh, I was so ADHD today. That's not really true. There's a difference between being a little distractible and being kind of generally distractible. So kids who sit down and then immediately 5 minutes later find themselves doing some other activity they didn't even know how they got to, or they go to the internet to look for a topic and 3 hours later they don't know what they're looking at anymore, but it has nothing to do with the thing they started with. It's kind of a general wandering of attention. Those are classic signs for ADHD or dyslexia. And what I would say is that if a certain part of the environment of a kid's life is not working for them, and then you put them in a different environment and suddenly they seem brilliant, then you really have a clue. So like for me, I struggled when I had to sit and read, but I could talk to tons of people. I love talking to people. It turns out to be the way I learn best. So when you see these strengths mirrored with these weaknesses, you know that something's up. And the best way to figure out what's going on is just take your kid to get tested.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I knew one family once where even though they had done testing, they had gone to the school because they thought something was wrong, and they asked over and over, what can we do? And every single agency kind of resisted and said, no, just he needs to try harder, do this, do that. And this gal eventually looked at the family history. And the family history was just rampant with dyslexia and just these brilliant, genius people that did these amazing, they were very well known. One was head of Chicago Bank, all these things. But it was rampant with autism and all these things. So it's not easy, is it, David, for people to figure this out sometimes?
No, and I think it's great to look at your family history, too. Dyslexic folks or, people who have autism or sort of broadly defined learning disabilities, there's a genetic component to this. So, now when I can look back at my family, I'm like, oh, right, ADHD, that probably came from my dad.
Yeah.
And if you look at his life, it makes a lot of sense. He did a lot of different things. He had kind of an ADHD life. So now, when I go on to have kids, I'm going to look at my kids and I'm going to keep an eye out, not knowing you never know what kind of kid you get, but I'm aware that it runs in families, and I'm not going to be scared of the label. That's the thing that's amazing to me. The kid gets tested and they don't have a learning disability, well, then it's not a learning disability, and you can move on and think about, well, why else might my kid be struggling? But to not get tested, to just think, oh, my kid's going to outgrow this, that seems ridiculous to me. Because at least if you have the test, you know exactly what's going on.
What was that like growing up with a dad with ADHD?
So I tell actually a story in the book because he didn't know we had ADHD. And I did, because he didn't have the language, I just thought, well, that's kind of a quirky character, I guess, sort of like me. So in some ways now, as we both have come to understand that we both have ADHD, it's great. It's something we have in common. It's something that we see as a similarity, almost like we're part of a community of ADHD people. But I think as a kid, there was a lot of clashing because we tried too hard to do things the same way. And who I really felt for was my mom because, it was just the three of us. I was an only child. And any dinner table conversation was like a tennis ball match. The two of us interrupting each other, talking very, very fast. My mom just watching this conversation go back and forth and not really headed in any particular direction. And so it took us a while to figure out that family dynamic.
That's an interesting insight.
A lot of people have come to me after this book and asking what my next book will be. And whether it's specifically around family dynamics or not, there's something separate from the school system that relates to how one learns and how they interact with their family and with others in the real world, which I think is important and I'm particularly curious about. So I think there might be something in there. I'm also particularly curious about the work world, too. I think maybe I'll write working differently or living differently or something. We'll see.
David, I'd like you to talk a little bit about your organization, Eye to Eye, which sounds like it does phenomenal work.
So Eye to Eye is a national mentoring program that matches college students who have learning disabilities with young kids, usually around middle school age, who have the exact same learning disability. And I started it when I was 18 years old. I was 18, and I went off to Brown University, and I thought to myself two things. One, I think Brown maybe made a mistake. Like, I was a kid who was failing out of elementary school. How the heck did I get into an Ivy League school? And the second thing that occurred to me is if I had known someone who was in college who had a learning disability, that could have made, so much of my high school and middle school years easier because they could have told me how to get through it in a slightly different way. And I said, okay, well, the first part, I'm just happy I'm here. I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go talk to Brown and say, "Hey guys, I think you made a mistake." But that second part around what would it have been like to have a mentor? While I knew I couldn't go back in time, I thought I could be that mentor. I could go and mentor, that fifth grader. So when he or she gets that diagnosis, they have something really optimistic to think about. They have their future as a potential college student to think about. And so I started doing that mentoring, and then overjoyed, I found that other people at Brown who also had learning disabilities wanted to be a mentor. And what we realized is we were really unpacking what was right with us. There's a lot of conversation, I think, about what's wrong with people who have learning disabilities. And what we wanted to do was go and talk to these kids and say, here's what's beautiful about you. Here's what's right about you. And yes, you might struggle with focusing, but your tangential thinking means you're going to have incredibly creative ideas. Or you might struggle with reading with your eyes, but you might be a great auditory listener. And so you can read with your ears, and that's okay. And that's, by the way, how I read too. And it just built from there. And, now many years later, it's a program that exists in 20 states in America. We have 57 chapters, and we're growing. And it's definitely, it's my greatest joy in my life that I get to be a part of this work.
And how do people find out about Eye to Eye, David, and also your book?
So there's a couple of ways that folks can engage with us. Easiest way is go to eyenational.org, which is the website for the nonprofit Eye to Eye. And you can also go to davidflink.com. And both sites have stuff about the book and stuff about the organization as a whole. And then I would say Facebook and Twitter are great places to kind of interact with us. So if you want to go to the Eye to Eye National Facebook fan page and like us and start the conversation there, follow us on Twitter at E2E National or Dave Flink. Both places are ways that we engage with our national community.
Great. And we are talking with David Flink, author of Thinking Differently. You're listening to Wellness Talk Radio. I'm Chris Costello. You can check out our website at wellnesstalkradio.com. David, I want to ask you a little bit also about, you talk about your own education. And one of the things you talked about was that you got the help you needed during your education at an alternative high school. And I guess I'm wondering what was so different about that from your previous education?
So one of the things I learned at that high school, and it's been lessons that I've been teaching others ever since, was to understand how my mind worked was going to be the way to unlock how I was going to do well in school. I later learned when I majored in education at Brown that word is called metacognition, but that just means thinking about thinking. So as someone with a learning disability, if you can figure out this is how I learn best, and then apply that to your world around you, anything is possible. And that's what I loved about that high school. I would say, I can't sit this long for a test. And they would say, oh, that's great that you know that your mind doesn't let you sit that long for a test. You can break it up into 2 sections. I'd say, oh, really? I can? And then I realized that one of the secondary skills to being successful with a learning disability is being a good self-advocate. So I had to say, I can't sit this long for a test. And then I would learn that the third piece of that is being able to know, well, how can you take this test? Well, can you do it in 2 parts? Yes, great. So then you start to figure out how to build a world around you and how you learn. And doing that in school actually plays out in life, too. I mean, most of my success in the working world, including writing this book, has been a product of understanding how I function and getting the help I needed. So when I sat down to write this book, the very first thing I did was find a publisher who was willing to bring in not just a person, but a team. I had a team of people at HarperCollins who would spell check every word and make sure my grammar was right and help restructure things when I kind of went out of a linear fashion, since my mind isn't always so linear. And, this book, it's funny that it has my name on it because I feel in many ways it's a product of a community. It's a community of stories, and it's a community of editing. And that's really what represents the book.
Yeah, that would have been a good front cover with about 40 names on the front written by.
And even in my education, right? Like, no one goes through school and it's just like one teacher and one student, and that teacher taught the student everything they needed to know, and then the student just went on and did that thing. I mean, it's sort of an old way of thinking. Like, you have one, apprentice learns from the master and then goes on. That's not how my schooling was at all. I learned as much from my peer group as I did from my teachers, as I did from community members, as I did from the internet, right when it was getting invented, was when I was finishing school. And that's what's great about learning, is, that learning can happen in lots and lots of different ways. And if we embrace that instead of problematizing kids who don't learn the one traditional way, then really it's not just kids with learning disabilities that can succeed, it's all kids.
In the book, David, you mentioned your parents were very supportive. And, although you may have felt that you were failing in areas in school, you didn't feel that way with your parents.
I hit the parent jackpot. I know I did. My parents, no matter what was going on in school, they just celebrated my successes, no matter what they were. And, self-esteem plays such a crucial role in people's learning, and I really understand that looking at my own life. I think I've benefited from the fact that they just said, oh, David, okay, you're interested in theater? Fine, go do theater. Well, we're going to be at every show. Oh, now you're interested in basketball? Fine, we're going to go and celebrate that. And they didn't put the stakes, sort of high stakes on me, like, what, you're not the lead in the play? We don't, it was just, as long as I was doing stuff that I was happy about, that was enough. And that's what gave me the resiliency to go back to school every day, even when I was struggling sometimes, and to just try it again. So, yeah, my parents played a huge, huge role. And in Eye to Eye, our mentors play not the same role as a parent, but in a supporting role in making sure that kids feel really great about themselves.
And you mentioned your mom was a teacher, which must have been really interesting.
Yeah, my mom and I had a lot of conversations growing up and all the way through writing this book about what it meant to be both a parent and a teacher. Particularly when you have a kid who is struggling in school in a way that she did not. She was kind of probably a typical person who went into education, in that she succeeded in school, and then she wanted to go and teach kids because she loved school so much. And so to see me struggle, I think, was hard on 2 levels, both for her as a teacher and as a parent. And on the other side of it, what she would say now, what I've heard her say many times, is having me as her son gave her great insight into what it means to really celebrate all learners, because ultimately she succeeded in engendering a real love of learning in me and a love of school. I mean, not only did I go on to college, I went on to graduate school, and now I'm deeply and rooted in education as my life calling, and it's because of what I learned from her. But I know that when I was young, and she said this many times, it was hard. And whether you're a teacher or not, when you're a parent and your kid is struggling, you're struggling. It is very, very hard to watch your kid struggle through school. And I think she just always felt like she was supposed to know exactly what to do. And when I wrote this book, I went back to her and I said, I'm going to put our story in exactly as it happened, our family story exactly as it happened, so parents know the reality that there isn't always an exact right way, but there is a way. And that's why I really kind of wrote this book as a manual, one that hopefully over the years parents will continue to turn to help guide their kids through school.
David, it really is an inspiring guide for parents of children with lots of different ways of learning. And I want to thank you so much for being on the program today. And just once again, if you can mention where people can find you, because I know there's lots of people out there that would like to hear this message.
Well, I'll say, thanks again for having me on and for all the listeners. And you can go to davidflink.com to learn more about the book, or eye2eyenational.org to learn more about the nonprofit that I run.
All right. Thank you so much. You're listening to Wellness Talk Radio. I'm Chris Costello. You can find out more at wellnesstalkradio.com. Sign up for our mailing list and get the newest interviews. Next, we're going to be talking with ABC News anchor Dan Harris, and he's going to be talking a little bit about how to start meditating. This is part of our weekly series on meditation, and today he's talking about what to do if you don't think you have the time to meditate, how to support yourself and figure out how to take the time to add meditation to your daily routine. We also want to tell you about a great website, solvingsam.com. Check it out. They're doing a nice fundraiser for the music program. They're selling organic dark chocolate. You can find those at different places around the Santa Ynez Valley. I know there's some at Mother Hubbard's that you can purchase to support their program, or simply donate from their website. This is to support the funding for the Solving School Music Program. They pay for 90% of the arts and music education, and we all know how important that is for kids. So go to solvingsam.com if you'd like to donate or find out more about the program. Thanks for joining us on the show. And next we have Dan Harris, ABC News anchor, followed by a rebroadcast of our interview with Dr. Dean Ornish, integrative medicine expert. We're glad you could join us. What do you do if your mind keeps wandering? What is the least amount of time that I can sit and meditate and still get the benefits that scientists talk about?
The scientists haven't come up with the minimum dosage. It's a funny term when you're thinking about meditation, but that's the term they use. We don't know what the minimum dosage is to get all of the health benefits that we believe are associated with meditation, which include, lowering your blood pressure and boosting your immune system and changing key parts of the brain that have to do with stress and compassion. But I've asked around a lot, and the sense that I get from teachers and scientists is that it's okay for me to recommend that people start with 5 minutes a day. And what I say to people is that you should start with 5 minutes a day and tell yourself you're never going to do more. Because what I don't want is for people to add meditation to their to-do list and have it become one more thing that's stressing them out. That defeats the whole purpose. And many people may feel that they're too busy to meditate, but 5 minutes a day is doable for anybody, no matter how busy you are.
I'm Chris Costello. Today we're talking with Dr. Dean Ornish, author of The Spectrum and many other best-selling books, named by Life magazine as one of the 50 most influential members of his generation. Dr. Dean Ornish has also served on the Senate Committee for Integrative Medicine and is the founder and president of the nonprofit Preventative Medicine Research Institute in Sausalito, California. We're so pleased to have Dr. Dean Ornish joining us today.
Well, they're the ones that I describe in my new book, The Spectrum. They're what we eat, how we respond to stress, whether or not we smoke, how much exercise we get, and the quality of love and intimacy in our lives. And so what I've done in my new book is I've categorized foods from the most helpful to the least helpful along a spectrum, hence its name. Because part of what we've learned is what really enables people to make sustainable choices is a sense of feeling free and in control. And the whole concept of a diet is based on feeling restricted in what you can't have and what you must do, and that's not sustainable. Willpower and patient compliance are just creepy words to me, because even more than being healthy, most people want to feel free and in control, and as soon as somebody says, eat this and don't eat that and do this and don't do that, you want to do the opposite. It goes back to, don't eat the apple, and that didn't work, and that was God talking. So what we do is to say, look, there are no good foods or bad foods, but some foods are clearly healthier for you than others. And if you indulge yourself one day, it doesn't mean you cheated or you're a bad person or all these moralistic terms that people like to use. It just means eat healthier the next. because what matters most is your overall way of eating and living. And so, in fact, studies have shown that people who overall eat the healthiest are the ones that allow themselves some indulgences, because life is to be enjoyed. And so if you're trying to reverse a chronic disease, like reverse heart disease, that's a pound of cure. You want to move as close to the healthy end of the spectrum as you can, because we found in all of our studies the more people changed, the better they got. Whether it was heart disease or diabetes or high blood pressure or prostate or breast cancer or whatever, the more you change, the better you get. But how much you change and how quickly is really a function of what you're trying to accomplish. So if you're trying to reverse a serious illness, you might want to eat mostly on the healthiest end of the spectrum. If you're just trying to lose a few pounds or get your cholesterol down, find out where you are on the spectrum, and then move a little overall in the healthier direction. If that's enough to accomplish your goals, to lose the weight or get your cholesterol down or your blood pressure, that's great. If not, then go further. And so it's possible to personalize and customize a way of eating and living that's just right for you, based on your own needs and genes and preferences.
Okay, so you're obviously a guy that, walks the talk as far as health. What do you do for your own health?
I do the things I tell other people, I suggest other people to do, all the things we've been talking about.
Okay, so what kind of things do you eat?
I eat mostly healthy food. I indulge myself sometimes, like I encourage other people to do. I work out. I spend as much time with my wife and my son as I can. Do at least a little meditation and yoga every day. Part of what we've learned is that the consistency is even more important than the duration. Sometimes I don't have time to do an hour a day, so I'll say, well, do I have a minute? And I'll say, because I have to admit I don't have a minute to meditate, then I have to say my life is so out of balance, something's really wrong here. So I'll usually find the time to do the minute. And if I do the minute, chances are I'll do more than that anyway, because it's getting started. It's always a challenge. But even a minute has value, because if you meditate for a minute, it subconsciously carries through the rest of the day. It's a little like if you hear a song on the radio and then you find yourself humming it later. It's the consistency that's so important, and that's what we recommend.
Can you kind of just go over, what are the optimum foods for health?
Well, the optimum foods are ones that it's not only just what you exclude from your diet that's harmful, but also what you include that's beneficial. There are hundreds of thousands of beneficial substances in certain foods that have anti-cancer, anti-heart disease, anti-aging properties. But more importantly, they actually make you feel. Some of these foods, blueberries, for example, and even chocolate and tea have substances that actually make you grow new brain neurons. You can actually grow so many new brain neurons in a few months that your brain gets measurably bigger. That was thought impossible just a few years ago. And it's the parts of your brain that you want to get bigger, your hippocampus that controls memory, your frontal cortex that processes information, and so on. And so when people realize that the fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes and soy products are rich in these substances that really are protective and make us feel good and improve the quality of our lives, then it becomes a different context for making these choices, from fear of dying to joy of living, which is really what makes it sustainable.
And I think as you eat better and better, you feel happier and more joyful.
You do, and then it comes out of your own experience, not because some book or doctor told you, but because, and so what we do is to help people connect the dots between what they do and how they feel. When I do this, when I eat this way, when I live this way, I feel good. When I do this, I feel bad. Maybe I'll do more of this and less of that. And then it makes it more sustainable, because there's no point in giving up something that you enjoy unless you get something back that's better and quickly. And because these mechanisms are so dynamic, when you follow the kinds of recommendations that I talk about in this spectrum, your brain gets more blood, you think more clearly, you have more energy, you grow more brain cells, as we talked about a moment ago. Your skin gets more blood, so you don't age as quickly, you don't wrinkle, you have more of a healthy glow. Your sexual organs get more blood flow in the same way that Viagra works. And for many people, these are choices worth making. Fear of dying is not a good motivator, because we all know we're going to die. It's just a question of when, and it's too scary to think that something bad might happen to you, so people tend not to think about those things, so they don't. But joy of living is a very powerful motivator. And when people make these changes, one of the most effective anti-smoking ads was Christy Turlington, the supermodel, has a wonderful website called SmokingIsUgly.com because her father died of lung cancer, and she got so tired of people looking like, the glamorous model, smoking like it's sexy and cool and beautiful. Well, nicotine causes your arteries to constrict, which is why in your heart it can cause a heart attack because it reduces blood to your heart, or in your brain it can cause a stroke. But in your skin it makes your little arteries in your face constrict, which cause you to wrinkle faster and get that kind of gray pallor. And also it constricts the arteries to your sexual organs. So half of guys who smoke are impotent. So instead of making it sexy and beautiful, it really makes you ugly and impotent. How fun is that? And so by helping people really connect the dots between what they do and how they look and how they feel, we find that these are ways of creating sustainable changes in lifestyle that people can really stick with, as opposed to a diet you get on and then you get off.
Yeah, I was surprised in Spectrum. You mentioned, I think, at one point that 30% of the population is still smoking. Is that correct?
It is correct. And in some countries like Japan, it's closer to 80 to 90%. And you say to people, well, why do you smoke or overeat or drink too much or work too hard or abuse yourself? These behaviors seem so maladaptive to me. And they'd say, Dean, you don't get it. These are very adaptive because they help us get through the day. They say, I've got 20 friends in this pack of cigarettes, and they're always there for me, and nobody else is. You're going to take away my 20 friends? What are you going to give me? Or they use food to fill the void, or alcohol to numb the pain, or they work too hard, or watch too much TV, or too many video games. There are lots of ways of numbing or killing or distracting ourselves from pain, or literally or figuratively bypassing it. But as we talked about at the beginning of this interview, the pain is there for a reason. It's to say, hey, listen up, pay attention. You're not doing something that's in your best interest. And then when we can use that experience of suffering as a doorway for transforming our lives, as Rachel Remen says, our wounds are our windows, our opportunities to really transform, then people sometimes look back on the suffering as a blessing in disguise because it got their attention that enabled them to make these changes that have made their lives so much more joyful and meaningful.
Well, and I think, don't we have to look at, with smoking and obesity and some of these other behaviors, a lot of these issues have a very strong addictive element, and including, I think, what's going on with our food system right now. I know Dr. Hyman mentioned that the processed foods have some of the same additive properties as heroin and cocaine.
Well, they're addictive to the extent that they meet an unmet need. And the real unmet need in our culture is the sense for connection and community. It's a basic human need that so often goes unfulfilled. And if you can meet an unmet need in business, you can create a multi-billion-dollar business, even if you don't do it all that well. I mean, look at the chat rooms in AOL when they first started, created a multi-billion-dollar business, which the whole Web 2.0 is now based on. Facebook and MySpace and so on. I mean, a lot of people have got 1,000 Facebook friends. They're not your most intimate friends, but even just that sense of community can create a multi-billion-dollar business.
And then there's Twitter.
And there's Twitter.
Do you do Twitter yet?
Yeah, sure. I was in a conversation with the CEO of Twitter at the TED conference a few weeks ago. And it's, again, just these short little ways of saying, hey, I want to feel connected to someone else. The Starbucks, it's like, come on in, hang out here. We've got high-speed internet access and soft couches and nice lighting and good things to eat and drink, So that's really the unmet human need. And so if we can approach that more intentionally and say, okay, it's addictive to the sense that, if I'm going to use food to fill that void, one person said, fat coats my nerves and numbs the pain. So instead of saying, okay, let's get rid of all the fat in our diet, to say, how can we address the underlying issue more directly? How can we turn off the faucet around the sink that's overflowing? How can we use these approaches to quiet down our mind and body, to experience more of a sense of peace and joy? How can we learn to have more compassion and love and altruism in our life as a way of spending time with the people that matter to us? And part of the value of science, as I mentioned earlier, is to raise the awareness of what really matters in our lives. And as we understand how much these things matter, then we begin to realize that the time that we spend with our friends and families isn't just a luxury that we do after we've done all the important stuff, it's the important stuff. And so we can then say, oh, gosh, being home in time for dinner and spending it with my friends and family isn't just something that I do when I've got time for it. I need to make time for it. It's as important as anything else that I'm doing, and perhaps even more so. And then when we work on that level, then we find that people are much more likely to make and maintain lifestyle choices that are life-enhancing than ones in self-destructive. If we only focus on the behavior, it doesn't work that well. If we just give people information, that's important but not usually sufficient. If it were, nobody would smoke. It's on every pack of cigarettes. We have to work at a deeper level. And then we can help people use the experience of their suffering in whatever form it comes as a doorway for transforming their lives rather than just as some kind of thing to be endured. Does that make sense?
It does. I want to get back to a little bit about just the issues of food in our culture. And I know one of the things that Dr. Wheels said was if he has to sum up health advice in one line, he said that the single most important thing that one can do for good health is to stop eating refined, processed, and manufactured foods. Now, do you agree with this, or what do you think about that?
Well, I don't really totally agree with that because, some foods that are manufactured are quite good for you. And I've been consulting with some of the big food companies to get them to make healthier foods. And so when you go into McDonald's, for example, and you see this fruit and walnut salad, which is, it's fruit, it's apple slices, fresh apples, mandarin oranges, walnuts, and several different kinds of lettuce and grapes, that's a good thing. For many people, it's an alternative to eating foods that are a lot less healthy for you. And so one of the reasons that I did that was I learned that in a lot of lower socioeconomic areas in parts of the city, they don't have grocery stores there, but they have McDonald's. And so I figured, okay, well, if we can put some healthier foods there, that maybe that's a good thing. And McDonald's is now the biggest purchaser of apples in the world because of that one salad. I mean, that's the scale that they work on. But there's a lot of junk food out there, too, no doubt. And so, yes, ideally, if we can all eat locally grown, sustainable, organic produce, clearly that's the best way to eat. But I wouldn't say that all processed foods are bad for you. A lot of them are, but some of them aren't. And so it really becomes a question of how can we find the right balance between what's optimal and what's going to be practical for people.
Right. And now do you see the food companies coming around?
They are. At first, many of them were concerned about being, the next big tobacco and being sued or being legislated out of schools and so on. I was able to bring together, for example, former President Bill Clinton, because I was working with him on his own diet and lifestyle since '93, and the CEO then at the time of PepsiCo, Steve Reineman, and the president of the American Heart Association at the time, and that led to the decision to take the junk food, the sweetened beverages out of vending machines in schools and put healthier foods in there. And we first we tried to get the vending machines out of the schools, and we realized that a lot of schools resisted that because they make money that they use for their band uniforms and instruments and things like that. And so we realized that the problem wasn't the vending machines per se, it was what went into them. And so many of these food companies, which initially were doing these as defensive positions against litigation or legislation, what they're finding now is that's where their revenue growth is occurring. At PepsiCo, I chair PepsiCo's Health and Wellness Advisory Board. 2/3 of their revenue growth has come from their healthier foods, and their new CEO, Indra Nooyi, is totally committed to migrating the portfolio to healthier foods because that's where the parade is moving. That's where things are going. And so when it becomes good business to do this, then it really becomes sustainable, and that's what's happening.
So they're starting to pay attention and make changes?
They are, and it's very easy to try to look for a villain, somebody to demonize. Oh, these big food companies, they're bad. Well, to me, much more skillful is to say, okay, how can we take this power that they have, the power not only to make and manufacture foods, but to influence the way we think about foods. Some companies, they'd say, these are our good-for-you foods and these are our fun-for-you foods. And I'd say, well, you know what? That's the problem. Why isn't it fun for you to look good and feel good and have more energy and think more clearly and have better sexual function and all the things that are fun in life? And why can't we make it fun and sexy and cool and hip and crunchy and convenient to live and eat healthily? And now they're beginning to do that. And they, with all their advertising and marketing and resources, they can make it fun and cool to live and eat healthily and to exercise and to meditate and to do these things and to make it more convenient for people to do that. And so that's the work I've been doing, rather than saying, oh, all these big food companies are bad, to say, look, how can we work together to make things that are even healthier and to change the way we think about, to get away from this, am I going to live longer, is it just going to seem longer, if I eat and live healthily, to say, wait a minute, these are false choices, we can have both.
And when did you first get on the boards of some of these companies?
I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2000. I was giving a talk there, and I got invited to a small breakfast that then President Clinton had, and I was seated next to a guy. I said, hi, I'm Dean Ornish. He goes, hi, I'm Jack Greenberg. I said, what do you do? He said, I'm the CEO of McDonald's Worldwide. And I thought, God, why would God put me next to the CEO of McDonald's? What are we going to talk about? And then I started to think, well, maybe there's an opportunity here. And sure enough, there was. And so I was able to, over a period of time, motivate McDonald's to take all the trans fats out of their French fries and so on, to make these salads that you see there. PepsiCo owns not only Pepsi, but Tropicana, Gatorade, Aquafina, Frito-Lay, Quaker Oats, and so on. And so to work with them to make healthier foods, to create this Smart Spot logo to help people identify what are the healthier foods, to talk about not marketing unhealthy foods to kids, and to make healthier foods that they can eat. And so through this kind of combination of working with these big companies, working with the Mars company to develop healthier forms of chocolate. They have a treasure trove of research showing that chocolate in small quantities, particularly dark chocolate that's high in flavanols, are really good for you. And to not only but then also to show people how to, it's not just what you eat, but also how you eat. The DVD that my wife Ann has done that's in the back of our new book, The Spectrum, has a little meditation called Eating with Ecstasy, how you can meditate on a single piece of dark chocolate and really give it your full attention. And then it can be exquisitely pleasurable and sensual and joyful, and you get this huge amount of pleasure with very few calories by eating mindfully. Whereas, I can be in a movie and be totally engrossed in the movie and eating a bag of popcorn or something and look down, the bag of popcorn's empty. It's like, wow, who ate this? So I got all the calories and very little of the pleasure. So it's not just what you eat, it's also how you eat. And again, working with these companies, say Mars owns the Dove Company, they can say, let's have a Dove moment. Take a moment out of your day and do a little meditation. And you can meditate on this little square of chocolate. That can really break that stress cycle for a number of different women. And so, whereas if you just say, hey, go ahead and meditate, people might do it. If you say meditate on a piece of chocolate, suddenly that reframes it as being something that you don't just do because it's good for you. You do it because it's fun for you and it's good for you. And then if it's both fun for you and good for you, then it's sustainable.
Seems like a lot of our societal challenges right now are stemming from excesses, in money and food, and somehow we got to get the ship turned around.
But the excesses come from this misperception that, the more I get, the happier I'll be, or the more I get, the healthier I'll be. E. Cummings, the poet, once wrote, more and more and still more, what the hell, are we all morticians? That idea is now, I think, being challenged as people are having to deal with less. Not in any way minimizing it, but for people to realize that, gosh, maybe all that stuff didn't bring me as much happiness as I thought it would. When someone is several $billion and is well-known, a lot of power, and they still aren't particularly happy, they can't really tell themselves, gosh, if I just had another $1 billion, I'd be happy. They've kind of come to the end of that myth. In some ways, it's more reassuring to think that those things will bring you happiness, and only to actually get them and find that they don't. And so there's an opportunity in all of this crisis here to re-examine what really does bring happiness, what really does bring health, and what really does matter in our lives. And to that extent, then maybe something positive can come from it. Again, not to minimize the pain and suffering, but there it is. What do we do with it is really the question.
And, we can be grateful the asteroid didn't hit yesterday, too, so...
That's true. We wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, no. Missed it by 1 day.
Well, the mortality rate is still 100%. It's one per person, whether the asteroid hits us or a heart attack or whatever. So to me, the more compelling question, the real spiritual question, the transformative question is not simply how long we live, but how well we live. And so there are opportunities here to say what really matters and what doesn't, what is really meaningful and what isn't. How do I really want to spend my time and resources, and what is really most likely to bring me that lasting sense of joy and pleasure. And that's really what I find most interesting. It's not about, opening your arteries. It's about opening your heart in other ways as well. And when we work on that level, then we find we can use these very high-tech, sophisticated, state-of-the-art scientific measures to prove that even on a physical level, people improve more than had ever been shown before. But if you talk with them, they'll say that's really what might have gotten them interested in these approaches, but what really sustained them was all the other things that we've been talking about.
And it is so dramatic. I changed my eating lifestyle about 3 years ago, and, I was telling Rip Esselstyn the other day, the guy that wrote Engine 2, that... Yep,
I gave him a nice quote for that book.
Yeah, it's a great book. But, I was telling him, I feel like a 25-year-old some days, and I'm certainly not a 25-year-old. It's great.
Yep. I think somebody, Satchel Paige once said, how old would you be if you didn't know how old you were?
I want to backtrack a little bit. We were talking about the food corporations and, our processed foods and things, and you mentioned that you're on several of the boards. Have you gained a lot of insight into their challenges, what they're dealing with as far as moving that boat, into a healthier arena for people?
Well, sure. Part of what they are trying to do is, imagine you're the head of a public company and you've got billions of dollars in revenue that comes from products that may not necessarily be so helpful. And you realize that you want to make more healthful foods, and that's where the market is going, but you can't just suddenly stop making those foods. So the question is, how can those portfolios be migrated in ways that are sustainable and that won't because if you're losing money as a corporation, you're not going to be around to do much good for anyone. So it's really finding the right balance. And as I get older, I take more of a longer time horizon about where are we going, and how fast does it take to get there. It took us 14 years to get Medicare to cover our program. It was enormously frustrating, it's particularly when they're paying for all these things like angioplasties and bypasses that are dangerous, invasive, expensive, and ineffective largely. And, it became a radical idea to ask people to change their lifestyles. And we had to actually get a letter from the head of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute saying that it was safe for older people to walk, meditate, quit smoking, and eat vegetables. I mean, it's at that level.
I loved that story in the book. That was great. Is it safe?
But at the same time, I think as I get older, I realize that some things take a long time, but if it's moving in the right direction, it's a little like turning an aircraft carrier. It takes a long time to do it, but once it turns, it can go anywhere. And so that's how I look about the work that I'm doing with some of these large food companies. I really respect what they're trying to do and appreciate the chance to work with them.
What's next for Dr. Ornish? You've written a great book called Spectrum, and I'm sure our listeners will be picking it up. But what's next for you?
Well, I like the opportunity to participate in health reform. I think that the world is catching up with us, and we have an opportunity to really change the system, to make it a true healthcare system and not just a disease care or a sick care system. And so I'm always looking for leverage points, and having seen what a powerful difference these changes can make, how can we get it out to people who can benefit from it? And so the opportunity to do work with health reform, to work with these large companies. I write a monthly column in Newsweek and on the Huffington Post. I'm always looking for ways of how can we, I chair Google's Health Advisory Board, and so we're looking at online applications of these approaches. And so I think that, there's a convergence of forces that now makes this the right time for a lot of these ideas that we've been studying for more than 3 decades to finally come into the mainstream so that people can really benefit from them, and that makes me really happy.
People want to find out more about what you're doing. Can you give them a website to go to?
Yeah, our website is, if they just go to ornish.com, O-R-N-I-S-H, it's a shortcut to our nonprofit institute website at the Preventive Medicine Research Institute. There's a lot of downloadable information and guided meditations and so on that people can have. And so I appreciate the chance to be of service in this way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ornish. We appreciate you spending the time with us and look forward to talking with you again.
Take care.
All right. We're glad you could join us on Wellness Talk Radio. I'm Chris Costello. Today we're going to be talking with Gail Sheehy, author of 17 books and author of the best-selling book, Passages. And now you've got a very exciting project, which I was very honored to be a part of, called the Daring Project. And I'd love, Gail, if you could explain a little bit about what that is all about.
Sure. Well, it's a delight to be with you, and I'm so happy that I've had your story on my website. So this is a nice exchange. Having written 17 books, finally entering my 70s, and having written about so many other people's passages, men and women, probably thousands of men and women, and their life stages and the passages between them, I finally decided it was time to turn the lens on my own passages. How did I do? What was it like growing up as a girl journalist in the 60s, early 60s, when you were closeted in the women's department if you got onto a newspaper at all? And through my finding a mentor and joining New York Magazine just as it was debuting as the first city magazine in the country, practicing the new journalism, which was a whole different form of writing journalism, being part of the family of most exciting young new journalists who then were Gloria Steinem and Tom Wolfe and so many others who broke through the usual who, what, when, where, why newspaper form, and we adapted the techniques of fiction to use dialogue, characterization, scene setting, and total immersion in our subject, often saturating ourselves in the subject or in the milieu that we wanted to write about so that we would have a personal experience to relate. So that became a large part of my career, and I then moved on from journalism into writing books. And so when I finished writing my memoir after 3 years of excavating, which is really the only term I can describe, because it's like pulling your ribs apart and pulling out the stuffing in between and looking for the magic stones that will reveal to you what was going on at a different stage, how you felt about it, why you acted the way you did, would you do it differently today. And when I got finished, I actually for the first time saw the theme of my life. We don't really stop and think about the theme or the repetitive ways that we react to the things that happen to us. But the theme of my life was daring. Daring to take chances, to jump in to do something I'd never done before, daring to try a different kind of journalism, daring to break a little hole in the glass ceiling for women in journalism in the 60s, and daring to take on assignments or to come up with assignments that I really had no business doing, including my first political story, which was a story about Robert Kennedy. And I had no reason to think that I knew how to write a political story, but the editor of New York Magazine came knocking on my door the night of the launch of New York Magazine and said, "What do you know about politics?" And I said, "Well, my mother's a naturally born bomb-throwing Irish Republican bomb thrower, and my father's a country club Republican. So what I know about politics is it's about fighting at the dinner table." And Clay Felker, who later became my mentor and much later my husband, said, "Great, then you'll understand Bobby." "Bobby who?" I said, "Bobby Kennedy. He's running against G. McCarthy for president, and I want you to go out to California and cover his campaign there." And I said, "But I've never written a political story." He said, "Well, now's the time to start. I need you to leave in 2 days." Well, it's at that point that you are confronted with this thing. Do I dare to take this leap and, land on my face in a pile of humiliation because I don't know what I'm doing? Or do I just take the chance, and if I fail, then next time maybe I'll know how to do it better? And that was one of the first times that I took that leap, and I did work through my fear, and I had an amazing experience that was historic, really, because I was traveling with Bobby Kennedy while he was preaching gun control to very hostile audiences in rural communities in Oregon, with men guns hanging off their shoulders, and I swear they had raccoons or possums on their shoulders. Very angry, but he managed to get them to listen to what he had to say, and he seemed fearless about it. So I was able to ask him about that. He actually invited me to sit next to him on a campaign plane because none of the senior reporters wanted to go. It was terrible weather and raining and a small craft and bouncing up and down the mountains over the Cascades in Oregon. And all of a sudden, as we were coming in for a landing to Portland, that we couldn't see it because the rain obscured the windows, but another craft was heading straight at us. And all of a sudden, our little craft dropped like a stone. And in the middle of the drop, with men screaming and my stomach turning over, Robert Kennedy quipped, "I knew Gene McCarthy was desperate. I didn't know he was that desperate." I couldn't believe it. He had the equanimity to make a joke in the middle of what could have been a death experience. But that gave me the insight to write about him as a man who had seen so much death in his family as a Kennedy, lost 2 brothers and a number of other members of the family, and violently, that he was not afraid. He was a total fatalist. And the very next night after my interview, his own life was ended at the point of a gun. So that was my baptism into writing political journalism, and I was hooked. So I developed a habit of when I feared, and I'm a normally fearful person. I've even had a couple of panic attacks. So when I fear doing something, that's when I grit my teeth and make myself jump off the edge of the swimming pool like I used to do when I was a swimming competitor and dive in. And even though I don't necessarily, finish the race or succeed, I'm more confident about trying it the next time because I got my feet wet and I didn't die from it. And so when I fear, I dare.
At Wellness Talk Radio, we'd like to invite you to come check out our website at www.wellnesstalkradio.com. Hope you have a great week.